All right, let's talk a little bit about some longer term control of blood flow. So acute control is fast, but it isn't perfect. It misses perfection 10 to 15%, right? So there's a variance there that has to be dealt with. So one of the things that we need to have a system for is a tissue that is seldom used, but then becomes often used. One of the amazing things about the human being is its adaptability, right? You know, with enough time, energy, and effort, even a guy built like me could run a marathon, right? Why? Because we adapt. We can adapt to change. We can make tissues behave differently because of their use. So if a seldom used tissue becomes often used, or if a tissue like a muscle increases its demands, you know, let's say it hypertrophied and underwent hyperplasia. Well, guess what? A hypertrophied muscle that's now bigger and has more cells needs more stuff, right? Needs more oxygen, needs more nutrients. So when that happens, when the tissue itself changes, acute control will fail because there isn't enough capillary beds, right? And that takes time. That you can't change in seconds to minutes, but you can change it in minutes to days, right? So vascularity is the tendency for tissues to how many vessels do they have per cell volume. Vascularity changes. So tissues which are used often get more vessels and more capillary beds. That provides additional oxygen and additional blood flow. This occurs, one of the main stimulating factors for this is when tissues are starved for oxygen over the long term, and not like starved like not getting any, starved like not getting enough, right? When they don't get enough oxygen over time, that is one of the stimulators for angiogenesis. So a tissue that isn't getting enough oxygen sends the signal to grow more vessels, right? That's smart. So the body grows more vessels to the area that is in need of additional oxygen. Angiogenesis, I think your book goes into it, but we're not going down that rabbit hole, right? So it's a very complex process, and it's fascinating, but it just doesn't have very good yield for you. You might talk a little about angiogenesis and med path of vessels when you get to Professor Kaiser's talk. Okay, so vascularity, how many vessels are present, that develops due to the maximum blood flow, not the average blood flow, right? So let's say you're a sprinter. Well, you might only run for 30 seconds, right? But your muscles have the vascularity to deal with that 30-second maximum, right? That vascularity goes with the pinnacle, not with the average. So what do you think happens to muscle as you train for a sport? More vascularity or less? More. Very good. Okay. We also get collateral circulation. I would imagine by now in the anatomy lab, you've talked about this term, collateral circulation. It's actually quite an amazing trick of biology and evolution, collateral circulation, because it means that in a lot of places of the body, there's essentially more than one path for blood to go through. So as angiogenesis triggers the growth of new vessels, that also often triggers the development of collateral circulation, increased blood flow to an area. And remember, collateral circulation serves a lot of purposes. It's great when we lose a vessel for sure, but remember that we're a moving thing. So sometimes our body itself will block a vessel as we're performing some activity, right? So collaterals still supply the muscle even when one is crimped off because you're holding a weight or your bone is pushing against it or whatever. All right, so if we look at the vessels in particular, like their structure, we can see 4 patterns of change. Okay, so if we have an increase in blood pressure over time, okay, that's a lot of patients, right, have a high blood pressure. So depending on where the vessels are, we get 2 different changes. In small vessels, we get the lumen gets smaller and the wall gets thicker. Now, this is actually not a good adaptation because the smaller lumen is more resistance. So we have a higher pressure need. So our high blood pressure has created vessels that need a higher blood pressure. Do you see the problem? So that isn't ideal, but that's what happens in small vessels. We get a smaller lumen with a thicker wall. Why would the body do that? It's about the thick wall. The thick wall can contain the higher pressure better, right? It's more durable. The problem is the lumen gets smaller, which makes your resistance higher. Now, in larger vessels, specifically vessels that don't constrict very much, all right? So that's like your medium-sized arteries, the aorta doesn't constrict very much. Your subclavian artery doesn't constrict very much because they're great, big, huge things. So in those vessels, what we get is we get an increased wall thickness, but the lumen doesn't change size. So it just gets thicker and stronger. It doesn't get smaller. In C, here we have, what if we have an area where we've had increased blood flow over time, all right? In other words, a muscle that you haven't used very much that now you're using a lot. Well, that will result in an increased lumen diameter. That's good. That's a bigger path to carry more blood, right? But not a lot of change in the wall thickness because the pressure hasn't changed. We just want a bigger road to bring blood through, right? To supply more tissues. Now, in the weird case where you have both things, both an increased flow and an increased pressure, we get a combination of effects. So we get the wall thickness increases and the lumen increases. So we get both things. And you would see this like in if you were training for a marathon, for example, you would have regions that would get the kind of remodeling that we get in D. So generally speaking, high pressure over time, walls get thicker. High flow over time, lumen gets bigger.